Hi, this is Bob Murphy, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Libertarian Christian Podcast. I'm Nick Gosling, Executive Director of the Libertarian Christian Institute. With me today is Dr. Jamin Hübner. Jamin holds a Ph.D. from the University of South Africa and is currently founding chair of the Christian Studies Department at John Witherspoon College in Rapid City, South Dakota. He is also our first guest on the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Today, we'll be talking about libertarian Christian scholarship, the state of Christ in the academy, and what the future may hold for libertarian and Christian academics. We'll also be making a special announcement pertaining to an exciting new program of LCI. Jamin, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. It is a great privilege to be here and to be the first guest of all things, too. So really appreciate it. And I have to confess, however, that I didn't listen to all 3 episodes yet of this podcast. So I got through the first 1.5. So if I repeat some things you've covered, I apologize.
No, it's great to have you here, and don't worry about that. So, it's interesting. You and I, actually, we just met for the first time this last summer, but we know some of the same people. Mm-hmm. So you're friends with Josh Feinberg, and Josh is now on the LCI advisory board, and his younger brother is my best friend. So that's kind of interesting that we had that connection.
For sure. Yeah. Josh was I think the only person who could kind of be in my wedding for all the people I asked. They were either overseas or busy or something. So, Josh and I go back a few years, or I don't even know how long it's been now. But and then we met at Austin, and I think it was over lunch or something. We began talking about your experience in the financial world and learning different things there. And so, I that one event, I met so many different people. It was really great.
Yeah, it was certainly a great conference. So tell us a little bit about your background. You've actually kind of taken an interesting career journey. And so you're a professional theologian. Tell us a little bit about kind of your upbringing and how you got to where you are in academia today.
Well, I guess I'll start kind of with the earlier years. I grew up on a farm and ranch in southeastern South Dakota, and I was the youngest of 4, and grew up, you'd say, kind of a Christian conservative household. And my parents were very hardworking German entrepreneurs they've done everything from restaurants to retail to real estate, mainly in their small town environment, and really have been blessed with a great home, and so I guess I got into theology in my last 2 years of high school. It was sort of unexpected, but I'd always sort of been discontent with the stale models and sort of dead state of the church, at least from what I could see. And I knew there was something better, as I read the scriptures, there's something alive about it that I was missing. And so I guess that a number of different experiences kind of led me into studying things that I thought had more eternal value. I could just take over the farm. I could do real estate like my dad and get into that world. But I was just too curious, after doing some reading, that I just realized how much I didn't know, and I wanted to know more. And but I still had interest in a lot of practical more immediately hands-on things that maybe my family, was interested in. And so I went into college as a theology major and a political science minor. And that continued for, I think, a year and a half or 2 years before I dropped the minor. And I was the head of the college Republicans for a year. And I think it was kind of at that point that I became disillusioned with the whole state of affairs with regard to contemporary American politics. I had to, if I'm going to lead a college group and get in front of people or call people up, I better have a good reason for doing it. And I guess I didn't have that. I couldn't really find it. I mean, I knew that things like socialism wouldn't work out very well. I could regurgitate some things I heard on the radio by Rush Limbaugh and others that I listened to for hours in the tractor. But there was a lot of unanswered questions. And so I just sort of, it seemed like going into politics, at least as I understood it, was, if I could put it in a sentence, it's like trying to manipulate large masses of people. I mean, that's basically what the business you'd be going into. And I had no interest in doing that. And so I was more of a truth seeker and a curious person and, wanted to search things out instead of having to constantly please audiences. Now, being in the academy, you're doing the same thing, in different ways. You always have different constituencies to please, but it's, there's been a lot of twists and turns along the way. I listened to some of your stories by Jason and you and Doug, and I share a lot of similarities with that narrative, but I can't quite, paint a coherent a picture probably as you could. I can't find like a year or a moment where I said, okay, I'm disillusioned with the political status quo. I want to know more about economics, and I consider myself libertarian. It was more of a gradual process, and probably began, like a lot of people, just with that disenchantment, with political rallies and the shameless indulgence in all of the propaganda and stories that are made up during the election season. I remember going to a rally where George Bush was in, I think, Sioux Falls, and I can't remember what year it was. And I can't remember if he was with John Thune, who's a Republican senator for South Dakota, or not, but I just remember being in the front row, and I shook George Bush's hand, and seeing all these people behind me with this herd mentality, this spirit that overcame everybody there, and then seeing a paparazzi, a photographer for a journal, you could see his reactions that he was just disconnected. He wasn't part of this, and so I had. I was looking at both. I was looking at the crowd and experiencing this and looking at this photographer who's just there to take pictures. And it's like, okay, so this person's outside of this experience. Should I be too? I mean, is this a conscious choice I'm making, to participate in this sort of swarm activity that we witness here in American politics? So I don't know. There's a lot of things like that I could probably point to that crack the soil up, so to speak. But yeah, I got into, I did a Bachelor of Arts in Theology and then went to seminary and did an MA in religion. And I eventually came to want to teach as a professor. And that meant I had to do a doctoral degree, even though I thought it was a waste of time and money, but hey, finish that, and doing all the different things. I've come to appreciate a lot of aspects of the academic world after, participating in various committees and boards and things and publishing, but, there's a lot of attachments too. So I don't know if that helps it out a little bit. And you look at my CV and you say like, what I have to make so many different CVs to different job applications because it's so all over the map. It's like, okay, so you went and spoke on, a Christian feminism in the late 1700s at this conference in Canada, and then you went and spoke on libertarianism in Austin, Texas, and then wrote a book on apologetics. It's all over. But there's reasons behind that, but it would take a little while to explain. So, but yeah, I mean, interest in economics and always having an interest in synthesizing and trying to figure out the relationship between organizations of large people, government, church, whatever, and Christian thought, I guess, has always sort of been with me. So hopefully that sort of explains a little bit.
Yeah, Jamin, it's one of the things that's really interesting is you mentioned meeting George W. Bush some years ago, and one of the things that actually just came through the news cycle I saw earlier today is one of Bush's daughters is now out raising money for Planned Parenthood, and Franklin Graham put out a statement basically saying this is like, raising money for Nazi death camps, and which may well be true. But what I'm thinking to myself is, why wasn't Franklin Graham opposed when George W. Bush was starting all these wars in the Middle East, which displaced millions of Christians and led to the death of millions of Christians, as well as non-Christians as well, who, I mean, we must also be concerned about unbelievers, because at some point in all of our lives, we were unbelievers before we came to the faith. So, I mean, it's good that, some people in the religious right are calling out Planned Parenthood, but where was this concern with the wars when George Bush was the quote-unquote evangelical president? And, as I was listening to your story, I mean, I couldn't help but think of, like, Socrates in the Republic. So it's kind of like, you're around all these guys who are sort of like the sophists, and they all just want to win arguments and win over the masses and always be on top. And you're kind of in this mindset of, I want to be the truth seeker. I want to contemplate the true, the good, and the beautiful, and lead where the truth follows. So you've certainly taken an interesting journey there. I think it resonates with, like you said, where a lot of us have come from in our Christian walk, and in the way that we look at our politics. So, as a Christian libertarian academic, what do you kind of see as the development of libertarian Christian thought, particularly as it pertains to scholarship and academic theology? So, I mean, I know we can go back to the ancient world, and there's certainly a lot of libertarian insights and impulses that we can see in the patristic writings, but throughout church history, and I mean, this is something that I talk about quite a bit, there's sort of been various competing strands of thought as it pertains to Christianity and the state. But really, when you go back to pre-Constantine, we see a very strong libertarian basis right there at the beginning of the church. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think I'll just pick up from your last sentence. I think you're generally right. I mean, a lot of people are going to say, well, this is anachronistic. Of course, it wasn't libertarian. How could it be? Libertarianism didn't exist until 50 years ago, or something ridiculous like that. But yeah, I mean, how do we describe the character, the tone, the message, the embodiments of the early church when it was so anti-statist, it was so critical of using political power to achieve various purposes, whether they're good or bad, and was very interested in voluntary organization and freedom, because that is the basis of a lot of other Christian virtues, such as generosity and giving. There's no such thing as giving and being generous if you don't own anything, right? I mean, property rights are assumed in that. Just as with stealing is wrong, you're assuming there's something called yours and mine. So, I mean, all the basic elements of a very organic society has been demonstrated through the incarnation and the teachings and character of the early church. And we read about that, and there's a lot of different metaphors for it. And they're not all organic and living like a body of Christ or, a vine and different things like that. But you definitely have that impulse early on. And yeah, it gets lost, a couple hundred years later. And when Christianity becomes legal, and not just legal, after 311, but becomes united with the state, which is just such a radical turn of events from the previous 300 years. So, I mean, you've reviewed this on an earlier podcast, and I think that's something that's sort of missing. And something that just is something that's really occurred to me, and something I want to study more on is Jesus scholarship. And how, academics are obsessed with different subsets and different readings, right? For the last 50 years, everybody's writing papers and presenting things on, a post-colonial reading of this text, a post-structuralist reading, a transgender interpretation of the Book of Ruth, or whatever. There's so many different subsets and obscure readings of different things. But the thing that's missing from all this that I find very interesting is there's no, at least that I can find, there's no, non-statist readings of the Gospels. There's something close to it in some New Testament scholars, because they have to. A good New Testament scholar is going to realize that in the original context, oh my goodness, Jesus in the early church didn't want to participate in all these things going on, and didn't want to have really anything to do with the state. It was a democratic society. They had elections for the senatorial class. We don't have, Jesus wasn't running for office. We don't have really record of hardly anybody running for office in these things. And so I would like to study more the historical Jesus literature, and to just ask the simple question, was Jesus really, was he just critical of the empire, the Roman Empire, and just critical of the Caesars of his day, or of the government in general? I think that's a legitimate question. Now, a lot of scholars, for obvious reasons, aren't going to be asking that. It's pretty radical, although, a lot of academics tend to try to push the envelope to, create something novel. But in this case, you're going to be labeled an anarchist or a libertarian, some other dirty term, and good luck finding a publisher, right? Good luck finding a talk at the National SBL conference, or something like that, or to the, other lectures at Princeton or Yale or Harvard. It's probably not going to happen. So I think that'd be interesting to study a little bit, because when we really, it was, who's the French sociologist, Jacques, what's his last name?
Ellul.
Ellul, yeah. He's the one who kind of opened my eyes to this a bit, that said, let's just look at Jesus' relationship with the state here and see what it's like. And I want to go a little bit further and say, well, is it just with this particular government? As if we change the rulers, then Jesus would just be okay with it. Then, he would be on board, and the early church would just be like, oh yeah, let's all go run for office. I don't think that's the case. But that's the assumption, under a lot of Christian thinkers today, and, is that, well, yeah, if Jesus was alive, he'd be a Republican, a Democrat, and he'd be telling, you'd have to run for office. I was told about a Facebook comment by a friend of mine who posted a link by a thing by John Piper. And John Piper's, a Baptist, a pastor in Minneapolis, and famous for, wrote some books in evangelicalism. And he had apparently, I didn't listen or read the primary source myself, but from what I understand, I get the general gist of it, and I trust it, I guess, is that he had the audacity to say that it was okay for Christians to not vote for president. And apparently, some friends of mine were like, this is radical. But if we actually turn to the early church, we turn to the Greco-Roman world, to early Judaism, and we understand Christianity as it was then, what we're actually going to be asking ourselves is it okay to vote? Not is it okay to not vote? Is it okay to do anything related with the government? Because the government is the tool of force, and force is fundamentally opposed to the kingdom of God. That's just not the way it works. So, that's just one of those things where, things have been turned upside down, and how Christianity today is known for legitimizing wars, in the Middle East or whatever, instead of preventing wars. I live in a very pro-military community. Ellsworth Air Force Base is here. There's soldiers everywhere you go. You go into Qdoba, you go to the mall, whatever. There's people in uniform. And there's a lot of military worship around here. And, if you just raise any question about maybe it's possible that killing people is wrong, maybe, violence could be wrong, like mass violence, you're looked at as with deep suspicion. And in the context of historic Christianity, it's just sort of like, well, we're missing something here. It's something's been reversed. But as far as your question, and sorry about that little rant, but as far as your question on libertarian ideas in Christian scholarship, libertarian Christian scholarship is generally a recent phenomenon. There isn't a lot of it, and that's why I'm going to focus more energy on certain projects in that direction. And so, what counts as scholarship? That's a question there. What was the first century writer's scholar as well, not in a modern sense, but we could go through the history up to the Reformation and the Anabaptist shift away from the state, and how that was viewed as extreme and everything like that. But I don't know. We can go any direction with that. But the point is, there hasn't been a lot. There has been libertarian scholarship and plenty of Christian scholarship, but together you're going to find little bits and pieces that critique the idea of coercion and violence in the state. But as far as a comprehensive, self-aware, conscious, systematic presentation of, the vision of the early church, for heaven's sakes, and the vision of a society without violence, there's not much of that, at least that's very explicit.
Yeah, and we've talked about that a little bit in some of our previous episodes already, how the early Christians, for example, how they wouldn't have had a developed understanding of economic thought, but the basic ideas that they represented, I think, identify perfectly with the non-aggression principle. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I was thinking about as you were describing sort of the history of interpretation and all these different schools of thought with which scholars interpret the texts, and for those who aren't familiar with the hermeneutic and exegetical debates, there's all these different kind of forms of criticism that scholars go back and apply to the text. So you can read the text as a literary critic, or as a feminist critic, or a postmodern critic, or a redaction critic. And there's just, it's almost dizzying how many different ways people can approach the text. But I remember reading something from N.T. Wright where he said, sometimes somebody who isn't caught up in all those minutiae, who's just coming to the text as a believer and reading the flow of the narrative, often can walk away with a better interpretation than these people who spill tens of thousands of pages of ink trying to argue for their little niche. And I think the reason for that is because, I mean, well, we do, as Christians, we do believe there's divine power is mediated through the Scripture, right? God speaks to us. He's moving. He's doing something through the Scripture, and we can vary on maybe how that happens. But the general idea that this is breathed out by God. It's spoken through God's prophets, God's apostles. There's power in the text because it points to Christ, who is the Word. As a result of that, there's something there that just allows us to be moved by the narrative of the text. And when you come to it without this kind of no, granted, we all come to the text with certain rose-colored glasses. That's not in debate. We all come with certain presuppositions. Nevertheless, when you kind of start to peel away this 21st century Western American God and country Jesus idea that so many of us have, the whole text of the Bible is overwhelmingly anti-imperial, anti-state. The state is almost always pictured in a bad light, and to even the extent where, we see God using evil empires in the Old Testament to punish other individuals. So God sends the Babylonians, God sends the Assyrians, and he calls them the club of my wrath and my sanctified ones. So here we have God using these evil pagan states for his purposes. And when you fast forward to what's going on in the early church, I mean, we have to look at it, and in the New Testament text as well, I think we have to look at it in that kind of context. You know, this is Israel's God. Yahweh is the God who uses evil against evil. He's sovereign over the kings of the earth. But that doesn't mean that he endorses what they do. It just means he's a sovereign God, and evil cannot thwart his hand. And this whole idea, like you were talking about how you're in a very pro-military area, and actually a friend was sharing with me recently, he had a fellow who's active duty military in his church, who's no longer in the church, but he said when he first met him, he was asking him about the Middle East and what he does in the Middle East, because he's in a combat type position. And he says, aren't you concerned about how your actions could potentially be, or most likely are, in fact, not just potentially, but are in some sense killing innocent people? And this guy, who's evangelical Christian, responded, they're all bad over there, which is just insane. I mean, that's baffling.
Including all the American church planters, I guess.
all those terrible missionaries over there trying to spread the gospel. And I mean, I think there's such a disconnect where we don't even think about the fact that most of the world's Christians right now live outside of the English-speaking world. Absolutely. They're in the global South, they're in the Far East, and they're in the Arab world. Most of them are not anymore in Europe and North America. The face of the church is changing.
That's right.
And I think the Western church is kind of missing the boat here on that.
Yeah, well, you bring up a lot there, and that's always it seems a profound reflection to just say that the Western Christendom, most people in Europe, and most of the Christians in the world are in Europe or United States and Canada or whatever. Yeah, it's not true. We can tell that to ourselves, but I'm just finishing teaching world religions for the first time, and I read a statistic that was incredible. It was something like 7,500 people every single day in the world, and especially in Europe and America, stop practicing Christianity. They stop calling themselves Christian. They stop going to church. Now, those numbers are offset by an increase in well over 10,000 a day conversions in the Southeast and in those areas. And so, I mean, some people are aware of that, some aren't, but it should at least affect the way that we talk, the rhetoric that we have, because it really doesn't do any good to, sort of, repeat the same things over and over. And I try to have conversations about it with people and say, these are the reasons why Christianity is in decline. And it's not because of other people. It's not because of these nefarious bad guys, these ambiguous secularists and the atheists and the gays and pornographers are running over the hills with pitchforks coming to get us sort of mentality or whatever it is. It's because, the models of the church hasn't kept up, and because, an Americanized version of Christianity isn't sustainable. It's really that simple, and it's going to show that. But let's get back to what you said earlier. What did you say before talking about the military? Well, about the military situation. I'll stop there for just a moment, because I was just doing some writing and I reread just yesterday, early in Luke's gospel, the story of the centurion and the healing of his servant. And one of my favorite stories in the Bible is it just really gets me every time. And the reason, we have to ask, well, why was this included in Matthew and Luke? Why is it significant that a centurion in the Roman army, number one, paid respect to Jesus, called him sir, felt ashamed to even have anything to do with Jesus. And then Jesus says, this guy's got more faith than Israel. I mean, we have to scratch our heads when we're reading this, but we understand how significant it was if we understand that the nature of violence and the culture of violence that was taking place there and in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, the Roman soldiers were notorious for being brutal, and the centurion was even more notorious for being brutal. They were the trainers. They were the real, hardcore, I don't know if you'd say the equivalent of the Navy SEALs or Marines or something, but certainly something close to that. So, I mean, a subset of a subset of a subset, of violence in this culture, the very incarnation of like everything that Jesus is trying to point us away from, needs a favor from Jesus. And this is how the story goes down. And, on the one hand, it's like, well, how could this person be ashamed? He's a soldier, God and country, being proud. Where's his spine or whatever, his pride of country. And what you have instead is he's just immediately shameful and very, just soft-spoken and just feels this weight. You can tell by reading the narrative. Well, it's because he's a centurion, because he kills people for a living, and that's a serious problem. And had he not repented and showed repentance and faith, Jesus probably would have said something like, dude, this is not right. You can't live like this. And just as Richard B. Hayes says in his excellent book, The Moral Vision of the New Testament, is that Christian soldiers were an anomaly. I mean, it just didn't make sense. It was like an oxymoron, Christian soldier. And so, yeah, we zoom forward 2,000 years to today, and it's like, people even say, well, if you are a real Christian, you'll consider the military. Like this is like, part of your obligation, and it gets mixed up with all this, propaganda about how serving, your country is like serving God and other such nonsense. But so, yeah, I mean, that's the militarism is a tough one to sort of expose because of the culture in which we live. It's just so glorified. But gosh, there was something else he said earlier before that, but I can't remember, and I'm not sure what it was. But I guess we'll just go from here.
We've kind of jumped around actually here
Sure.
to some interesting things that I think are very worth exploring. But one of the overriding themes I think that we can observe is that these things we lament, this sort of state idolatry, the modern day militarism, which is I think functionally equivalent to like worshiping Mars or Baal, if you want to take it back to the ancient world. It's the same kind of thing, except in modern America. But despite all this, like we just talked about, the demographics and the landscape of the church are changing. And I'm by no means an expert on the two-thirds world and what's going on in the church out there. I mean, I know some, but if I, just using my limited knowledge, had to make a prognostication, I'd say that we're going to see some very positive developments in the coming decades as our brethren from outside the Western world, who are already the numerical majority in the church, really start to take on the leading roles in shaping this next generation of Christianity. And I think that's going to really start to strangle out this idolatrous, militaristic, nationalistic form of Christianity that has been in power for so long. And that's just going to be a tremendous blessing for the church. But along those lines, like you mentioned earlier, the state of libertarian Christian scholarship is relatively new. And I think one notable thing to say on this is that throughout the bulk of church history, the vast majority of Christian scholarship, period, has come out of the West. And the future may not be that way, but that's the way it's been thus far. So, like moving forward through, we had kind of gone through the early church. You talked about the Anabaptists, who we don't really know a lot about from their own writings. Most of what we have about them was written by people who hated and persecuted them. We do have some from Minnow Simmons and others, but most of the Anabaptist contemporary writings were written by their critics against them. And then when you move on to the Puritans, right? And so the European Puritans and the American Puritans were actually very different. The American Puritans were much more hardline theocratic. We were kind of taught that they left Europe to pursue religious freedom. Well, really, they left because they thought that the European Puritans weren't strict enough. And so they wanted to come start a much stricter theocratic government in the New World. And we're actually going to talk about theonomy and Christianity in a future episode of the podcast. So maybe you want to pick up there, like going forward into the 18th century, the American Revolution, and onward into the 20th century, where we really start to see a lot more works of theology kind of put down on paper.
Yeah, well, that, and of course, as soon as you framed it up for a question, I remembered what I wanted to say before, so I think I'll go ahead and do that just before I forget it. But you were talking about a little bit about the history of interpretation and how that has, that explains how Christians at different periods have seen government, politics, economics, and other issues. And that's really, really important. And you can that's kind of the root of so many things. But behind that, something that has really become, I won't say an obsession, but a deep interest of mine in the last 5 years is doctrine of Scripture and bibliology. Is we really can't talk about, how the world should be or what the problems of the world are without doing theology, and we can't do that without hermeneutics, and we can't do that without knowing what it is we're reading. And what I've just sort of found in my work teaching and reading and writing in the past few years is, people have different understandings of about what the Bible is. We can pretend like we're all on the same page, and to some extent we are, but largely, different metaphors, different models totally shape the trajectory of what type of ethic we end up getting to. And I just taught on this morning in Intro to the Bible about how, for me, one of the most useful metaphors is the Bible as a map. And there's a lot of different there's different types of maps. And Kevin Van Hooser in his book, Drama of Doctrine, is a really great book on theological method. Talks about the Bible as an atlas, as a collection of different maps. How Jesus is the North Star, and there's different kinds and for different purposes and in different degrees and types of truth and different things like that. But throughout, I don't want to say since the Reformation, but since sola scriptura, a just and proper correction to the Roman Catholic bibliology, there's been a sort of idea that the Bible's like a manual. You hear that sometimes in Sunday school churches. The Bible's like a manual. It's like, well, no, it's not like a manual. You don't point to it and just do what it says. I mean, in that case, we'd be greeting another with a holy kiss, and all these different things that are obviously contextual, which all of Scripture is. And that's a whole other topic there, but that's really shaped my understanding too, is how all of Scripture is in a context. It's not just like, and this is preempting your theonomy discussion. It's not just like, well, there are some texts of Scripture that apply today and some that don't. N.T. Wright and Richard B. Hayes has tried really, really hard at saying that this is not a proper way of understanding how the Bible works or how interpretation works. This dichotomy it's a false dichotomy. All of Scripture applies. All of Scripture is contextual. It's just there's some work that has to be done in understanding what we do with the story and the content of the Scriptures. And so there are particular rules to follow in that. And so what you sort of have in the statism in America, in a lot of the theonomic experiments, whether it's in the Puritan context or just in theory, in the 20th century and beyond, really a lot of it has to do with what the Bible is, and because of that, what we do with it, and that goes down to, I mean, that kind of determines the war thing in Israel in the Old Testament. And I just had a discussion with a friend on the subject, and I was just suggesting that like violence was bad, like we shouldn't go to war, like it's not a good thing. And in a lot of Christian conservative mindsets, it's like the first reaction is, well, immediately to justify it, like say like, well, here's the exceptions. Why that instinct is there, I don't know. It's not a Christian instinct. I mean, you don't have many people in the early Christianity, their first instinct is to look for ways to justify violence. It's usually the opposite. But anyway, it's having that discussion, and the example is given, well, God commanded war in the Old Testament, and so therefore, it's like open, like that's the extent of the argument. No real method, no real exegesis, no real understanding of what the Bible is, or how it works. And so that's just something I really pound in a lot of discussions, because it's the root of so many disagreements. And when you're in a culture like American evangelicalism, it's a really simplistic biblicism and proof texting that leads to all kinds of things, from Zionism to this war, that war, end times, and a zillion other things that we don't have time to talk about. So, but anyway, I think that's behind a lot of the theories, as you said, the thoughts, stream. I forget what you said, streams of thought or theories of state church in those relationships and how to interpret the Bible. So I think that's a really important place to go, and there's been some really good recent work on that. But a lot of people just don't know that those books exist. So anyway, that's what I wanted to mention there. As far as your other question that you set up about getting into the 20th century and developments and things like that, Well, it's characteristic. You read any book on theology, basically. I mean, any serious academic book on theology, and there's going to be some talk about modernism. And I remember as an undergraduate at Dordt College studying theology, that I just didn't get it. Like a lot of the writers and a lot of people would talk about, modernism, but nobody would sit down and explain it for you. It's just like they sort of assumed you knew how traumatic this was, whatever this thing was, modernism, like the advent of the Enlightenment. And it's like, well, there were some summaries given about, rationalism and Descartes and the Industrial Revolution and foundationalist epistemology. But really from the early 1800s to early 1900s, just tracing the events there, can really help a person understand the way in which the world was changing. And if you noticed on my page on the libertarianchristians.com website, one of my favorite authors is Rose Wilder. And Rose Wilder's book, she was the daughter, I believe, of Laura Ingalls Wilder. She wrote a book called The Discovery of Freedom. A really great book. The beginning is sort of weird, but then it gets really, really interesting. And she was a world traveling journalist. And she described the changes in modernity better than, at least in positive economic terms, better than anybody else I'd ever read before. and what those changes involved are probably too much that we could describe here now, but a lot of it had to do with centralized authority, a lot of optimism about human reason. You have Darwinism, Freudianism, the Industrial Revolution, public education, and a zillion other things going on all at one time. And it was the failures of a lot of the promises of modernity, the wars, the First World War, the Second World War, the Great Depression. These were all experiments in, modern, centralized, authoritarian systems. I mean, the mass starvation in Russia in the late 1930s from controlling the food supply. Event after event after event, a lot of these things, and it already started going down even before that, created reason for doubt and skepticism. And we're reaping the fruits of that in post-modernity, where we have, questions of authority and truth itself, and a whole number of other things, and a kind of skepticism that's really never existed before. And so, what you have is the first, maybe not first, but like you have the foil for a critique of statism. Libertarianism, as we understand it today, is both a modern and a postmodern movement. It has its origins afoot in both of these worlds together. And you see that in von Mises. If you read Human Action, you can see so vividly how he has a foot in one world and a foot in another world. He's very modern on the one hand. He's very suspicious of religion. He says things that are very optimistic. And on the other hand, he's very critical and saying we're not getting to the real issues here. We can't make economics the science of math like you all say it can. And so in that period, you have a lot of the writings that are starting to deal with government, violence, and the state. Now, it took a while before a lot of that collapsed. It really collapsed in Russia with, the Berlin Wall falling was emblematic of that. And, there was, the some of the sort of socialistic economic experiments, like the New Deal, from 1929 to the 1930s. But then a lot of it had to be abandoned. It just wasn't feasible. And, the freedom and the productivity of capitalism started to really take off and show itself to be worth something. And I mean, it did before that too with the Industrial Revolution. But so you have theologians throughout this period. You have a lot of people. Early on, you have a couple Reformed theologians, the Dutch Reformed, like Herman Bavinck and Abraham Kuyper. Very, very well-read, very, very well-written. They're very smart theologians. Herman Bavinck was probably the greatest Reformed theologian since Calvin. and maybe ever till today, as far as I'm concerned. I've taught through his dogmatics. They're translated from Dutch, and it's a brilliant work, very balanced. And he was taught at a secular university, got a degree, I think a graduate school degree, if I remember right. And so he really understood a lot of the things that were going down with these cataclysmic changes, and had to deal with them theologically. And like Kuyper, both of them began to, in contrary to the Puritans, in contrary to the Westminster Divines, in contrary to that sort of that version of Protestant thought, Bavinck and Kuyper, they first of all recognized the coercive nature of the state and that this is an issue. And if you read their writings, they'll acknowledge. I mean, and just to see a theologian acknowledge that the government has a monopoly on force, I mean, that's a big step. I mean, there are a lot of theologians who won't do that. They don't even see that. And so Kuyper and Bavinck were really ahead of their game on that. And Kuyper was the prime minister of the Netherlands, not to mention the founding chair of systematic theology at his own university that he also founded. And he wrote, 2 systematic theologies, and was also was the anti-revolutionary party advocate, and ran a newspaper and did all kinds of things. So he had his focus in the political realm and in theology the whole time. And he wrote a good book called The Problem of Poverty. And it was recently translated in a new translation in the last, I think, decade or so. It can be bought on Amazon. And there's a lot of things he says in there. I don't agree with all of them. It's not that he was libertarian, but he understood that, we shouldn't depend on the government to do, to get the things, to have the results that the church should be entrusted with. Caring for the poor, taking care of, minorities and downtrodden, et cetera. The church should be on the front lines of this. And, he even said something like every dollar that, every dollar for food stamps is like a scar on your Savior or something like that, on the body of your Savior. I can't remember what the metaphor was, but it was really powerful. Like he's really trying to stress that the state shouldn't be doing really these type of things. Its purpose, and in his view, is justice primarily, and it's a more narrow term than justice than we have today. Today, justice, means something very broad, like, we all got to have a car and a house. This is justice, Someone's deprived of health care, which never existed for millions of years. This is justice or whatever. So, I don't know. Those are two figures that are there. And then, at the same time, you have the social gospel movement, where you have something very different that puts more emphasis that the government should be doing things. Walter Ruschenbusch is one figure there who's responsible. He was a Baptist preacher. Then you have the Niebuhr brothers, which I haven't read in a long time, but Reinhold Niebuhr's work is really great on depravity. I remember that much from reading him back in college. And Jürgen Moltmann was a German theologian. He's still alive, and I almost died when I heard that he was at this conference I was at, and I missed him by a day to have him sign a book that I'd read and published a review on. One of the greatest living theologians, considered a panentheist, and some consider him a liberation theologian. It was no libertarian, that's for sure, but he had a lot of good critiques about violence, and especially with his doctrine of creation and understanding, the relationship between God and creation. I think gave a much needed, a dose of I don't want to say anti-modernity, but it definitely balanced things out a bit. And then as we have here in the notes, like the formation of the religious right, which people who are a little bit older than me can talk about with more authority, because they sort of saw its development in Jerry Falwell and Liberty University and everything along with it, the moral majority and Christian Zionism and all of that. And it's a real mess, but you have a very powerful base that was created side by side with Billy Graham crusades and various other events that are just, they defined Christianity for an entire generation. Also defined what it means to be a Christian and have a Christian politic for an entire generation. And so there you have, like the one issue voters, whether it's abortion or other things like that, start to emerge. And, this is all a really crass, I'm trying to think of what this would be like if I was teaching it in a classroom, if anybody could understand, but really crass history and of some of these thinkers, but kind of brings us up to today. And there's a whole nother thing going on there. And I'm going to pause because I've been talking for a long time, but we can talk more about contemporary authors, and I'm going to grab a drink here. So,
with the religious right, I mean, I think a good portion of that came as a reaction to the counterculture and the hippie movement of the 1960s. And before that, you had the beatniks, like going back into the 1950s. So really, there's kind of these countercultural movements that sprung up in the aftermath of the world wars. Like you had mentioned earlier, the whole world was disillusioned especially after World War I. That's why you kind of had this rise in sort of existentialist thought and these authors who were adopting nihilism and other things of that sort, just because they'd seen all the death and the tragedy, especially those who had served over in Europe during
like
the
Moody
First World War.
and the rise of dispensationalism, this really depressing eschatology that has become a controlling paradigm for American evangelical thought. So I have to mention that there because it's really, so important that that theological paradigm came from that disillusionment as well.
Yeah, and we really see that, I think, in the whole rise of the religious right. And so I don't remember when it was published. I want to say it was sometime in the 70s, right? But Hal Lindsey wrote The Late Great Planet Earth, very, very famous and influential book, basically saying, the end is near. And so from that kind of came the whole left behind, imminent end of the world kind of thinking that has been so prominent in at least Western Christian thought for a very long time. And then on another point, you had brought up the Niebuhr brothers, and there's two of them, right? So there's H. Richard and Reinhold. And Reinhold, probably one of the most influential theologians of the past 100 years, alongside maybe Karl Barth would be the only other one I can think of who had quite that scope, at least amongst Protestants. And his approach to this whole issue of society and politics and world, he's looking at the text and he basically says, the New Testament is pointing towards this lofty goal of what things ideally would be like. Nevertheless, that's not the world we live in, and so we can't actually do it that way.
Right.
And this is also most people, when we to go back briefly to the whole issue of war and things of that sort, Augustine is famous for formulating the just war theory. Most people who throw that out have no idea what they're talking about. They don't understand just war. Any war is a just war.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But if it comes out of Washington D.C., it's a just war. That's just war theory for most American Christians. But Augustine's theory of the just war and those other thinkers who came after him was very strenuous and had a lot of criteria. And virtually no war the United States has ever engaged in would even pass Augustine's muster for a just war.
Yeah,
that's just to say that. But to go beyond that, Augustine believed that, much like Reinhold Niebuhr, that the vision of the New Testament was a nonviolent, non-coercive, kind of anti-imperial vision. And he argued that that was fitting for the time. But by his point in history, in the 4th century or so, things had changed. He was writing post-Constantine, and so it no longer really applied in quite the same way. And that was essentially what Reinhold Niebuhr was arguing in his theory of Christian realism. And I think a good majority of Western Christian thought has adopted that line of thinking without even realizing it. That what they're really saying is, yeah, this stuff in the New Testament sounds good, and it would be great if we could do it, but we really can't, so we have to do it our way instead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and I have read his interpretation of Christian ethics. I read that back in September, and now I'm remembering that particular part by Reinhold. What also is, it's not just an idea. I mean, you have that idealism in Niebuhr, but what's also going on is you have early Christianity, then it becomes wedded to the state, and then it starts to separate a little bit more again with the Reformation, where Luther says, you have it even in the confessions, in the Reformed confessions. There are two great gifts from God, the king and the priest. And you see this dichotomy throughout Protestant confessions and in Protestant literature. And the idea is there's two realms, right? You have the state and you have the tool of force and coercion. And the idea is that, God made that, and that's a legitimate sphere, and it does its own thing. And then parallel to that, you have the church, and it does its own thing, and it does the spiritual stuff. That's not the vision of the New Testament. That's not the vision of the church. Jesus and the early church, they did not intend at all that the gospel of Jesus Christ is restricted to a particular day of the week, to a particular realm of the universe, to a particular strand of thought. It was to be the beginning, the inauguration of taking over the world, which is that's why you had the language of king and kingdom, and preaching the kingdom to all creatures. And so the model of the church is, at least some theologians would say, and they have a point, that it's actually a model of life for all realms of society. Now that's very, very different than a post-Reformation perspective, where you have that division of labor, which is so characteristic of modernism and the compartmentalization of the university and all these other things. So I think that's the other thing too, is people are still thinking in terms of those divisions. And this is something Kuyper was trying to take behind the woodshed and shoot with a 12-gauge shotgun, is the idea that, most of this world, or the chunk of this world, is God's. And but everything else, it's not. There's a secular and there's a sacred. And Kuyper, in his famous quote says, there's not one square inch of this world, that God can't say, this is mine. And so, but that pulsates through our day-to-day life here in modern and postmodern Western world. It's like, well, I guess it's Sunday, I'll do something Christian. This whole idea is just like foreign to so many centuries and to so many groups. You sort of know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like you had mentioned, Kuyper, definitely not libertarian, but the idea of from which he was looking at the world, that you can't compartmentalize out different aspects of life and society and go, well, this is the state over here and this is the church over here, which is really, that goes back to Luther, right? And two-kingdom theology, as it's often called. But so Kuyper is totally right to say that, the vision of the New Testament is all-encompassing. And the mission of the church is to be God's agent of worship and evangelism and love and ministry in the world, moving towards the absolute dominion of Christ over all creation. And so we have in scholarship and in formal theology, in the last 50 years or so, there have been some authors that have started to move the conversation back in that direction. You had mentioned Richard Hayes earlier, and his book, The Moral Vision of the New Testament, is one of my favorite books as well. We mention N.T. Wright here a lot, who may be the greatest biblical scholar alive today, arguably. But there have been others as well. So where do you kind of see things at today? I mean, and also, I mean, there's a lot of scholars who we cite here at LCI quite frequently, like Greg Boyd, Scott McKnight, who would not identify as libertarian and probably don't even like the label, but they've had a big influence on the way we approach things. And when you really look at their vision of theology, it is it essentially libertarian in the truest small L sense. So where are we today?
Well, that's a great question. Yes, there are plenty of so-called libertarian impulses in today's contemporary scholarship. They're not going to be found very easily, but you find these themes and ideas and arguments scattered throughout what is often, as you sort of observed in professors of New Testament. There's a lot of different fields of theology. There's a lot of different fields of biblical study, and there's a lot of different fields. I don't think it is an irony that N.T. Wright, Scott McKnight, Richard B. Hayes, so we got people at Oxford, Cambridge, Duke, and other seminaries and prominent institutions. These are world-class scholars. I don't think it's a coincidence that they're professors of New Testament that are the ones so easily making assertions that so easily resemble libertarianism. I think that's precisely because of the characteristics of the early church. And so, those are a few. And I mean, N.T. Wright has been influential in my reading and in my work on his more academic than his popular works. His ongoing series of Christian Origins and the Question of God series is just amazing. It's going to be certainly one of the most powerful cases for the reasonableness of Christianity. I mean, he would never call it a work of apologetics. That's not really being an apologist and writing apologetics is not really credible in academia, because sometimes for good reasons, because you're sort of saying you already know the answers and you're in a position to defend it and so forth. But it is a group of work that's going to really serve the church for many decades to come. But there's others like Daniel Migliore. When I teach systematic theology, I teach 3 courses. So systematics 1, 2, and 3. And so it's God, creation, Christ, salvation, and then church, Holy Spirit, and eschaton. And I just tortured myself for 2 years on what text to use. I didn't want to just indoctrinate my students and buy whatever's the latest and greatest. I didn't just want to convince them of everything I believe is true. I wanted them to think critically, and I wanted to choose textbooks that were really, really high quality. And so I chose Thomas Oden's Classic Christianity. He's a patristic scholar, a Methodist, and I think he just passed away in the last year. Wonderful author, and his book is basically an ecumenical systematic theology. There's almost nothing quite like it. Then I chose Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics as one volume. It's not very well known, but its quality and its balance is just unparalleled for a number of reasons. And its sensitivities to modernity and other things are really valuable. And then I chose Daniel Migliore's Faith-Seeking Understanding, which is a 3rd edition, and he's a professor of theology at Princeton. And much more contemporary and progressive, very sensitive to feminist and liberation theology, and a lot of the contemporary issues in 20th century theology. But very, very well written. And so I used all 3. And we did each section for each semester. And anyway, Migliore, there's stuff in there that, you just got to say, well, of course, this guy's a libertarian. I mean, look at his critiques of the state, his critiques of violence, his his historical consciousness on 20th century experiments with statism, modernity, and centralized power. His understanding of the gospel and the impulses of inverting authority structures in the New Testament. Of course, he'd be terrified if we called him a libertarian. He would denounce that because it's a dirty word. But it's a good one volume, and you find things in that. Stanley Hauer Wass is an obvious one because, well, we got to go earlier to his professor John Yoder, who taught at theology at Notre Dame, wrote an excellent book called The Politics of Jesus. Really good, and he's a Mennonite. And so you draw a line from the Anabaptists, a dotted line at least, to him, and he does an excellent job at giving a case for Christian nonviolence, but is very sensitive to the New Testament world, which you don't always have with a theologian, and that's a whole different topic between the debate between biblical scholars and theologians. But Yoder's book had a profound impact on my life. I read it later, kind of in my intellectual journey, but just opened my eyes to some of the sayings of Jesus. The render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what's God's. And he says, most people have been reading this like this. This is validating the type of dichotomy that I just mentioned before. You have the world of church and Christianity and God, and then you have everything else, the world of government and so-called secular affairs. And the idea is that people are saying, well, this Jesus is Lord, this phrase and this text about render unto Caesar, most people would say that this is meant to say that they're not in conflict. He says, no, that's the point. The whole point is to set them in contrast to each other. Like, duh, that's what was so revolutionary. Again, Jesus died for insurrection. How do you explain that? You can't explain that if everything Jesus did was apolitical. If everything he taught, everything he embodied was non-political, didn't have political implications, why did he die? And why did he die for the reasons he died? These are the type of questions that N.T. Wright has really brought to the forefront, as well as Yoder and others. Well, anyway, Yoder's one of his students, Stanley Hauer Wass at Duke Divinity School, has written a bunch on similar topics. He's very eccentric. He's very entertaining to read. I've read his sermons, and I've enjoyed them. But putting it all together is a problem. Like, he's not a systematic theologian, emphasis on the systematic there, but is a tremendous theologian, has written a lot critiquing both consumerist capitalism and statist violence and trust in the government at the same time. And I have, issues with his understanding of what capitalism is. And consumerism as well. People today conflate the two as if they're the same, and of course they're not. Consumerism is not capitalism, and vice versa, though one is a precondition of the other. Those are some names where you're going to find some of these themes that raise legitimate and good questions. And then Scott McKnight, as you read, he's a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary, or I can't remember, in Illinois.
It's somewhere in Illinois, yeah.
Yeah. He's written some academic, but a ton of popular works, and I've read a few, and they're very good. But then you have, most of these names are unfamiliar to evangelicals, because evangelicals, in a way, and I don't mean this too condescendingly. I mean, I do identify as an evangelical in a sense. It's quite qualified, but they kind of live in their own world. You know what I mean? And you see this. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. I mean, I went to ETS and then IBR. I mean, I've done this for years, but this year I went to all of them. ETS, Evangelical Theological Society. So very conservative, you'd probably say fundamentalist. And IBR, which is more broad, and I said hello to N.T. Wright and some other folks who were there. And then went to SBL, which is a secular organization, Society of Biblical Literature. And they're all, it's hard to describe, the cultural what do you call it? The subculture of of academics. You have those who are just out there to get a name and are really into themselves, and others who are really humble scholars and great people, and then others who just don't know what they're talking about, but they have the right degrees, and so it's all kind of there. But evangelicals, they they kind of live in their own world in a way, and they would be familiar with the names Wayne Grudem and John MacArthur, for example. And Wayne Grudem and John MacArthur, Grudem teaches theology in Phoenix, and MacArthur is a famous Bible expositor on the radio, and also started the Master's College and Seminary in California. And they had an exchange. I can't remember the years, but they had an exchange about basically Christians' role in the government. And Grudem was pulling, the neoconservative line, we need to get as many Christians in office as possible. This is their duty. We have a responsibility to, try and influence the government as much as possible so we can, force, this way, our right way of living on the rest of the world. And this is like positive change. MacArthur, for being just as fundamentalist biblicist, and a very strong tone of what's right and wrong and black and white, interestingly said, no, really, we don't need to do that, and we don't need to put all this pressure on people to run for civic office. We shouldn't actually trust the government for the proclamation of the gospel and the kingdom of God really much at all. That I guess that was one episode that I think some listeners might be familiar with, but I haven't followed that much since, and I don't read them as much as possible. I listened to MacArthur when I was 16 and driving home from youth group or whatever, and listening to his sermons and stuff. But otherwise, you mentioned Preston Sprinkle. I don't know Sprinkle. I haven't read any of his stuff, but I guess you have, so maybe you could talk about that briefly.
Yeah, Sprinkle is also a New Testament scholar, like you had mentioned earlier. A lot of these guys tend to be New Testament scholars, and I listen to his podcast pretty frequently. I've read several of his books. He's just a very refreshing kind of thinker. And in more recent developments, he's doing a lot of work in the issue of gender and how Christians should basically deal with the issue of homosexuality. And he does adhere to the traditional view that same-sex actions are sin, but he would argue that the way the church has addressed the issue has just been very harsh and hateful and unchristlike towards people who struggle with that particular temptation. So, and that's not my area of expertise. I'm just by way of saying that's kind of what he's working on lately. But he's also done quite a bit in terms of talking about Christianity and violence and war and things of that sort. And interestingly, he came out of Master's College and Master's Seminary. And I've noticed kind of a trend there. There's been a lot of, not a lot, but a vocal minority of people who kind of came out of MacArthur's seminaries there, who are going in this kind of very libertarian-esque direction. And you had mentioned Grudem earlier. Grudem, along those lines, I remember, I want to say this was all the way back in 2008. He was a very early endorser of Mitt Romney, which I just found very, very interesting even at the time. In 2008, I mean, that was, my goodness, almost 10 years ago, but I had been a Christian for a couple of years around that time, but even I just kind of thought, what is Grudem doing here?
Well, then your instincts were right at the very beginning.
Yeah, I should have just run with the first instinct. So yeah, it seems like Grudem, who I don't want to bash him. I mean, he's done a lot of good in some other areas, but on the issue of politics, it kind of just seems to be like, whatever he feels like fits at the time is kind of what he rolls with. And it's not really unique to him. I mean, that's kind of just a broader problem in Christian thought, like we were talking about earlier with Reinhold Niebuhr. It's kind of like, well, this is what we have, so we got to do it. We got to do it this way. We can't really follow this high and lofty vision laid out in the New Testament, which, I mean, I would totally dispute that line of thinking. And I think, thankfully, I believe the demographics and the shifts are changing more towards a different way of looking at things that is more restorationist, that is more looking forward to the church as an agent, not through the state, not through coercion, but through love and ministry and the power of the gospel to really change the world and assert the loving reign of Christ through service into the world. As we kind of move towards closing this out, for anyone listening who maybe is an aspiring theologian, biblical scholar, pastor, what would your recommendation be to them based on what you've observed in both the broader church and academia as a libertarian Christian? What might they want to focus on? What should they avoid? And what are kind of the big gaps in libertarian Christian thought and scholarship where we need more research, where we need more scholars producing content?
Well, that's a good question. I guess, the rules of the wisdom of research kind of apply to all areas. Avoid cults and charismatic personalities. And if you find your blood pressure rising when certain topics are addressed, that tells you that you're obviously really invested in them. And it's just important to be self-aware of those, topics and conversations and things like that. I mean, we all know that we can't have certain conversations with family members and friends just because of these different things. And that has to do more with relational skills, I guess, but it's all related in academics too, But the books I mentioned are good to read, and it really depends on where a person is to look in different areas. For how do we do ethics with the Bible? Richard Hayes's book, The Moral Vision of the New Testament, is a great book. For the New Testament world, just understanding it a bit, there's a book called The World of the New Testament, published by Baker in the last couple of years. It's very, very good. And let's see, others I mentioned, we'll probably put them on the notes page, but academia is on a pretty serious decline right now, and it's probably going to keep declining and then stay that way because of online education and a lot of other things, consolidations and finances and global competition and a zillion other things. There are some students that I have would be great professors. I just have a hard time recommending that they go into it because, I have so many colleagues who are in trouble because there's just no jobs and they're closing and closing and closing. I'm extremely fortunate just to have a job right now, and I'm planting seeds in all kinds of areas, real estate, another master's degree in econ, and in a number of different things because I don't know what the future holds. But so it's kind of uncertain, but reading good books is always good, but finding what they are is taking me years, and so that's just been a valuable part. But gaps in research, well, there's a lot. One that comes to mind in Christian libertarianism is, what is freedom? We define it, generally in terms of lack of violence, lack of aggression and use of force. That's okay, but we got to have a more sophisticated understanding of freedom. There are people who have that type of freedom, but they're slaves, right? They're slaves to themselves, to their jobs, to their different ideologies and various gods and goddesses that they worship here in America and elsewhere. And so and this is something David Bentley Hart touches on in a really great book called Atheist Delusions, published by Yale University Press. He kind of critiques the idea of freedom in the context of classic liberalism, in saying how it's really sort of delusional, and he's I think largely right. There needs to be a more sophisticated understanding of what freedom is. Other areas are there's always the practical things about what should we do. We can't just have podcasts and complain about stuff. What should Christians really do, and what can they do to enact some kind of change? How should we understand the role of the church? What type of modifications should we make to the way we understand how church is done, our constitution, and should we be a registered nonprofit, and all these type of decisions? I think those are some things that could be worked out too. Otherwise, I don't know. I mean, it's something I'd have to think about, but there's definitely plenty of areas for research, and ethics in biblical studies and just hermeneutics is always an area that there's plenty of written on, but getting it to the masses and is the tricky part, to where it really affects the day-to-day conversations and Facebook posts that we're all insaturated in. So that's it for your question, as best as I can in a short time. So,
yeah, and as far as impacting the conversation over the long haul, that's a problem, I think, in broader academia, where you have a lot of academics who just write and publish things, and it never really goes anywhere. It never really actually makes it out to the general public and influences society. But along those lines, we did say that we would have an announcement at this podcast, and so that is how we're going to wrap up the show, by announcing that the Libertarian Christian Institute is launching a new research conduit for libertarian Christian scholarship. And Jamin, you are our general editor of what is going to be known as the Christian Libertarian Review. So yes. I'm very excited about this. I know you've wanted to see this happen for a long time.
Yes.
We have some amazing people on our peer review board. I can't believe some of them agreed to it, quite frankly. But I'm so glad they did.
I can't either.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and what we can expect to see from CLR going forward?
Well, this is a fully orbed academic peer review journal for articles and book reviews, and it's something myself and others have had envisioned for a long time. I've done a lot of publication projects in a lot of variety of areas, so this is just a really good fit for me. Nick is on the team to help do all kinds of things. Ruth Ryder, I haven't got a chance to meet her or talk with her yet, but she has agreed. Has 2 master's degrees, and she's going to be doing editorial work and some administrative work. And then we have peer reviewers, a big list of looks like about 10, and they all have their PhDs, some with JDs, and I mean these are it blew my mind. I mean when I was sitting back thinking, let's do a Christian Libertarian journal. We got to get peer reviewers. We just need 5. If we can just get 5, we'd be able to get indexed in major databases at universities and different things. And we didn't just get 5, but we got way more than 5, twice that. And there are people most of them I haven't heard of, but I mean, some of them have taught at multiple Ivy League institutions. They've published in the most respectable academic venues, from Rutledge to, Oxford and others. And they're economists, they're professors of history, they're historians, they're theologians, and humanities scholars, and a number of others, lawyers. And it just blew me away that within 2.5 weeks, we had this team. And so it tells me my goodness, there is a demand. There is something going on here. People want this. And of course, I always knew that because it's like, well, I want to write on certain issues, like some of the stuff we've been talking about on this program. Where am I going to get that stuff published? Where is it going to be published? I'm a peer reviewer for 2 journals, and now I'm this general editor, and I presented at these different academies. I'm a member of 6, 7 academic societies. There's strict limitations. I know how this works. I've been the person that says yay or nay to both articles and conference presentations. I know the politics involved and the restrictions and pleasing audiences and all of that stuff. So there's so many publications. Is there really room for another one? I had to think that. Is there really room? And it became quite evident that there was. Where else can we talk about certain things like freedom, politics, economics, and so forth in a Christian context, an ecumenical Christian context? There's almost nothing like that. I mean, the closest thing is like faith and economics. I've published a book review there of Sam Gregg's recent book, For God and Profit. Great journal. Hope to be continually involved. But I just know I'm not going to be able to publish certain things there on certain topics. And it's mainly for economics. What about other issues? What about political philosophy? What about history? What about humanities, theology? So, yeah, I'm not going to just read off to the description, but you can read it on the website. It's already posted, I believe. So we're really excited. This is a call for papers, and the full requirements are on the website, and we hope to have a great. I just got an email. Well, you know what? I just got an email 10 seconds ago from the same person. PhD student wants to publish something with areas related to this, and that's a great opportunity. Graduate students, for those who want to do book reviews, I sent out, as you know, Nick, a list of over a dozen different books that need to be reviewed for this kind of journal, and so lots of room, and it's going to be exciting, and hopefully, by the grace of God, the inaugural edition will come out in January. Basically 1 year from now, a little less than 1 year from now, in 2018. So that's kind of the goal, and we need to get submissions sent to me by August, ideally, to get into that inaugural edition. Hopefully, listeners will be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, and some of the manuscripts may be published prior to the release of the initial first volume. This journal will be open access, so we don't want to have any restrictions on there to keep people from getting the research, because like we just talked about earlier, we want this to actually go out and impact the church, impact the academy, get into the seminaries, and start moving the conversation. We're not just going to publish for the sake of publishing.
Right.
We want impactful stuff that's actually going to get out there and be a blessing to the church and move the conversation in the right direction. So if you're listening and you are a graduate student, a seminary student, and you're interested in maybe doing some book reviews, you can contact us. If you want to produce some original research, please reach out to us. You can reach Jamin at CLR, that's Christian Libertarian Review, CLR at libertarianchristians.com. And also, if you want to reach us regarding the podcast, you can write to podcast at libertarianchristians.com or visit us at libertarianchristians.com/contact. As always, I will put out a call for support. LCI is supported entirely by donors like you, and believe me, we appreciate you standing behind us. This is a ministry. It is our passion to be able to go out and be this alternative voice in the church for liberty, for freedom, in the context of the Lordship of Christ and the Christian faith. So please support us at libertarianchristians.com/donate. That's it for this episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Jamin Hübner, for joining us. Jamin, it was great to have you, and hopefully we'll have you back soon.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.